Let's get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today. This session is being hosted by the UX Researchers Guild. We are a community of researchers and research consultants who get together to learn, make connections, and do research following best practices with each other. By attending this event, you are consenting we're recording this, and we may be using that recording for educational purposes and occasionally for marketing as well. So if you feel comfortable sharing your camera and such, just know that this session is being recorded. I want to start off by letting you know a few things that are coming up on behalf of the Guild. So our April event features Roberta Dombrowski, who is a research leader and career coach. She's going to be discussing career strategy, career planning. And that first session is going to be on April 18th for researchers. And we're going to have a separate session specifically for research leaders on April 25th. So look out for those events if you are in the mindset right now of rethinking your career trajectory, planning ahead, and want to have that for some inspiration. When it comes to networking, we have a networking spreadsheet for this session, so that link will pop up in the chat here. You can share your details to connect with each other on LinkedIn. Following the session itself, we are also going to have breakout sessions for networking. So if anyone wants to stick around, meet with other folks, that will happen at the end of the session. I also want to let you know that as we move forward, you may have questions. So Leah will be facilitating Q&A. You can submit questions in the chat along the way or raise your hand. Following all of our Q&A, we will be awarding a prize to the person who asks the most interesting, thought-provoking, insightful question. And I think we'll be giving away a copy of the next book club's book, which is Interviewing Users by Steve Portigal. So please ask those questions and participate in our giveaway. Okay, so that's all the items that I have. Welcome to our first book group as the UX Researchers Guild. This is Accessibility for Everyone, and we have author Laura Kalbag here, and our Guild board member, Lija Hogan, will be hosting. I just want to introduce Leah a little bit. She is a principal experienced researcher and strategist at User Testing. She's also an adjunct lecturer at the University of Michigan and a Guild board member and just a passionate advocate for people. So welcome everyone. Leah, I'll pass the mic over to you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Danielle, and welcome to everybody who's online. I see a few names and faces that I recognize, so I'm so glad that you joined. But I also want to give Laura a little bit more of an introduction, just because, you know, she's got so much experience in this space, and accessibility is on a personal level very important to me, but also I think important to just enabling everybody to move through the world freely. So she is a British designer who lives in Ireland, as well as the author of Accessibility for Everyone. And just a note, we do have a discount code. And so if you haven't yet read the book or purchased a copy, definitely we'll make sure that we share that link so that you can get your own copy. She's also a co-founder of the Small Technology Foundation, which is a tiny 2-person and 1 husky not-for-profit organization advocating for and building small technology designed to increase human welfare, not corporate profits. So I think that's a great perspective to bring to this conversation. So welcome, Laura.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's such an honor to be here.
It's great. It's great. And I very much appreciate also the green in the background, given upcoming
I'm on
St.
theme.
Patrick's Day.
Yeah, St. Patrick's Day next week, and to match the cover of my book too.
Yes, that's also true. So where I thought we'd start today is actually a little bit more about what brought you to focus on accessibility in your professional practice. And obviously that has some bearing on why it is that you decided to write Accessibility for Everyone.
Yeah, so I was always interested in accessibility. I was very lucky. I started out in design and taught myself how to do web development as I was learning design because I wanted to build the things that I was designing. And I was very lucky to learn about accessibility on the web from the people who were sharing information on blogs back in those days, like 15, 20 years ago, about how to write code and design for the web. And there were lots of information about accessibility back then, people talking about how they might implement it. And to me, this all just made sense. It seemed obvious. Yes, of course we design things so that disabled people can access them as well. And I think a lot of that understanding of course, really comes from my background. So I have a brother who has cerebral palsy and he considers himself disabled. And he's been my brother since I was 3 years old. So my entire life, I've had one of my best friends be disabled and experienced how he accesses the world around him and the difficulties he sometimes has with technology. And so to me, it seemed obvious that this is something that we needed to focus on when we were building products for everyone in the world, because when we build things for the web, we don't necessarily decide who uses them. And so we should try to accommodate as many people as possible.
Yeah, and that's a really great point because if anything, in the work that I've been doing that is accessibility focused or adjacent, one of the things I've been learning is that technology often acts as a way of letting people bring the world to them as much as it is sometimes difficult for people who might be using assistive or adaptive technologies to navigate. But I think one of the questions that I really wanted to ask is, so there are a lot of areas of disability that we can consider. And one of the primary challenges that I run across is people not really knowing how and where to start.
Mhm.
So, what are your thoughts about a good place for people to start making their digital products, especially more accessible?
I think one of the things we have to do is not necessarily think about it in terms of the disabilities that we're trying to accommodate,
Mm.
because that is so wide ranging. We don't just necessarily have specific disabilities, but quite often people have a couple of disabilities that may interact with each other in a particular way. So really, we're trying to think about the needs of each user and what they want and how they want to interact with what we're building. That is far more important than identifying the specific disability or the specific technology that they're using. We want to think about people as in what they need and how to accommodate them. And one of the ways that I like to think about it is the things that we build, we think about how to make it easy to see, even if people don't necessarily see things like by looking at it with their eyes, they might have an equivalent experience of seeing something by listening to it being described to them. How people can hear. So perhaps that's having captions when you can't necessarily hear the audio content, and how people can find things easier to use. So in any way that you interact, whether that's with a voice interface, whether that's using a mouse, whether that's using a keyboard, whether that's using any number of adaptive technologies, and how to make it easy to understand. And so that really accommodates the variety of ways that we all understand the world, and specifically often people who have maybe cognitive disabilities or any kind of neurodiversity that may mean that you just have a different perspective on the way that the person who built the product has. And so I think breaking it down into those more simple boxes makes it easier to think about when you're looking at designing or researching or any of your work around a product, if you break it into those different perspectives, it's easier to think about rather than trying to spread your brain across all of the different like possibilities in terms of disability.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting that, you kind of listed everything out and, really talked about the different areas of disability, because I find that often with doing research in this space, you really have to focus on one area at a time. But you don't always have, especially if you're testing with people out in the world, you don't always know what they're going to bring with them,
Mhm.
right? So you might be interested in understanding one area of disability, but people are bringing multiple areas with them. And so, what are the sorts of things that you do to help to navigate that combination of disability when you are creating designs? So, you got to start with a focus, right? But then you have to also be able to flex with some of the individual needs that people bring to the table.
Well, a lot of the focus is often around the product itself and maybe the particular area or component that you're designing for, because by its nature, there will be specific needs that are specific to that type of component or content or whatever it is. For example, if it's text, then you're probably not necessarily thinking how much someone's going to interact with it if they have motor difficulties, if they might have difficulty with the fine motor control. I mean, maybe in terms of scrolling a text, but otherwise you're thinking about how do I make this text easy to read? And that's kind of the focus of that content. If it is a different kind of component, maybe it's something that has dragging elements to it. Well, then you're going to be thinking about a very particular set of needs that might vary across that particular utility. So it might be trickier for people to see the order of which or what they're dragging. It might be more difficult to actually have the motor skills to do the dragging action, and they'll need an alternative, different type of interaction for that. And so I think a lot of the time it's easier for the focal point to be on what you're building. And then whatever people bring to you, that you can use that to help you understand different ways and better ways that you can build things.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really great point. I just this morning saw this interesting quote, and it escapes me who said it, but it was something to the effect of, designing for the edge cases brings the middle in by, default. And so really getting, I think having that focus on how do we optimize this element of an experience, whether it's text or audio or video, to ensure that it's accessible to everyone is a great way to ensure that you're managing both all the edge cases and by that, by dint of doing that, also making sure that it's available to the great middle too.
One of the tempting things to do when people first find out about accessibility is like, well, okay, I've learned about screen readers and how they can be very helpful to people. Not exclusively blind people use screen readers, all kinds of people use screen readers, but it's people often will focus on that as a form of accessibility. And they'll be like, right, I'll create an entire different version of my product that is just for screen readers. I'm going to cater the entire experience only to screen readers. And the thing is, there you're making quite a choice for the people who use screen readers, that they need a different experience, that they'll want a different experience, that they don't have their own way of interacting that you don't necessarily understand yet. So one of the best things to do when you're trying to work on building better products for accessibility is just to make them as accommodating as possible, as flexible as possible, and try not to build on your own assumptions, and rather provide many ways for people to interact with what you're building in the way that they choose.
Yeah. And I think that that's a great point, and also just kind of an entry point to one of the things that we kind of discussed talking about today, which is about accessibility overlays. So I wanted to get your thoughts. What do you think about it? And first, you might want to describe for those who are not familiar with what that is, what that is.
Yeah, so you've probably seen accessibility overlays if you browse the web. as a person who has accessibility needs, you've probably seen it described as an accessibility widget. And if you maybe don't necessarily have those needs, you may have seen on all kinds of websites that you use this little button. Often it's a circular little button that's hovering around on a website as you're scrolling, and it's got a little universal human icon on it. And what that essentially is a tool that's a kind of a plugin that you can add to a website that says what it does is it creates an overlay that makes the entire product more accessible. You don't have to do anything. You just plug it in and it goes. And it's it's very tempting to think, oh, this instant solution. It's accessibility solved. I just get to press a button, I get to add it to my website, and everything is solved. The problem is that accessibility isn't like that, because people's needs very much vary depending upon the product that you're building. The product you're building will have its own quirks, its underlying code, which is often what these widgets are actually interacting with. They're often building upon the underlying code. Will completely vary from site to site, and it is all automated. So it is not done by a human. It is just done by a bit of software that's trying to do the best with the limited information that it has. And so usually not particularly useful. There's other issues that you have with these overlays. For one, by pressing it and saying that you want to use it, you are identifying yourself as a person with accessibility needs or as a disabled person. That has privacy implications. A lot of the products that we have nowadays, they have third-party scripts from all over the place that send data about the people who are browsing the sites off to all kinds of different third parties. You don't necessarily want to be identified as disabled. A lot of people don't. That can have repercussions for all kinds of public services and other things. There's all sorts of privacy considerations involved in that. A lot of the time, they're just not very good. And so they don't do a very good job. The people who are building the product think I've solved the problem. And so they don't actually pay any attention to accessibility when they are developing their product the rest of the time. And so it often prevents people from actually learning and understanding more about accessibility and how they can make their product better. And yeah, they're quite aggressive legally as well, these companies. So I will be careful with what I say. But they have also been known to sue people who have criticized their functionality. But they themselves have also been sued for claiming to make websites accessible when they don't. So I would say, if you can avoid it, I mean, sure, sometimes they might be useful as a band-aid, a sticking plaster, a temporary solution if you have specific needs that they can improve upon, but you'd have to be sure that they are actually solving those problems. And if you know about the suitability of the solution to the problem, you're probably a good part of the way to solving the accessibility issues with your site anyway.
Yeah. And I think there's that piece of really addressing what's on the site, but then I also think about, and this is something that I found very interesting with the people that I work with as researchers, that sometimes, I spoke earlier about the fact that the developing technology that we've got is opening the world up to more people. So for instance, more people with disabilities are employed right now because they can work remotely. And so technology is making employment more accessible as a service. But also there are services that are provided that are mediated through technology that enable people to access a lot of things that were previously only accessible if you went to a location at home. So for instance, we see mobility companies doing a lot of testing around how do we help people with mobility challenges to access things, or what does it mean to essentially try to bring experiences to people's homes so that, they aren't required to come visit a clinic, for example, a healthcare clinic. So
Yeah, well, it's
go
such
ahead.
a vital part of our infrastructure in general. Like the internet itself, the products that we use, it's the way we participate in our social lives a huge amount of the time.
It's a vast amount of our public services are provided to us primarily through the web. And so if we're not making that accessible to people, then it's a human rights issue, really.
100% agree. Yeah, I love that. So I do think that one thing that I wanted to discuss is we've got this kind of timely topic of WCAG 2.2 being released. So in your book, you speak to 2.0, right? But in October of last year, we just had 2.2 released. And the chapter 7 of your book is really around like global regulations and laws. And I saw a question come in from the audience about do we have any tips for people with smaller voices or less power in making an impact? And I wanted to combine those two concepts because I've had some experiences that kind of combine those two things. But let's start with, what are your thoughts about some of the new things that we're seeing since the release of WCAG 2.2?
So WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And so I wrote my book, what is about 6.5 years ago now. It was published. I started writing it around 10 years ago. So despite that, actually, it's not aged badly. Like the only thing that is maybe moved on a little is the WCAG guidelines. And so 2.1 was quite a departure from 2.0 in that it kind of changed the angle of the guides to be less prescriptive about the technology and more about how people use the technology, which is really a very valuable way of thinking about it, and also more future-proof because the technology that we use and we build is changing all the time, whereas the ways people use it is changing less quickly, at least. And so with WCAG 2.2, it's just added more guidelines on sort of specific things that are so specific use cases that come up in people's experiences and areas that they might have difficulties with. And so it just covers a lot more of those. So I think I was talking about dragging earlier. So that's one of the new guidelines is about dragging. The idea that if you have an element that requires being dragged in your interface, that you also provide a way of doing it that just requires a single pointer interaction. So you can just do it by pointing and clicking with a mouse or using a keyboard. And so it's just saying, hey, if you do have this very common type of component in what you're building, make sure that it is also accessible to people who might have these other needs. And I would say that these guidelines are incredibly helpful in terms of giving you a really big checklist, but which can seem very overwhelming. And I think particularly the language it's written in, it used to be a lot harder to understand. I would say now it's a lot less difficult to understand. But if you use it to get an overview and an idea of the kinds of needs that people have and the kinds of ways in which things need to be used, I would say that it's useful to refer to for specific things if you're auditing something. But it is also just a good learning experience for understanding, oh, I didn't really ever think about the fact that sometimes you want the target area that someone has to click on a link. You want that to be quite big. Even if the text is quite small, you want the clickable area to be quite big, because that will mean that if people are using a finger or a mouse, or they struggle to use one of those things accurately or have a precise control, they'll still be able to click that link as easily as anybody else. And so I find it's a great way of opening your mind to those kinds of things as well.
Yeah. And what's also interesting is you can see often how people are clicking and tapping on things when you're looking at like behavioral analytics. As you were just talking about the target area, I was just thinking about, I've seen
is it heat maps?
A heat map that just shows like where people are tapping, and they will, click or tap something that looks clickable, and the number of times that something should be clickable and is not, or the area is really hot in a much larger space than you would expect, is really fascinating. So if there's any, I think that's one way that I would recommend. So to that question about how do you convince people that, accessibility is important, you can show the data sometimes. Like that's a great way to um, highlight to people that that's important. But
One
I
of the
think,
things I often say about the idea of trying to affect change, if you're not necessarily in your hierarchy, the people above you aren't necessarily saying, we care about accessibility, is a lot of the time it's how much can you do in your own work? Because that in itself will make a difference. It all depends on where you are in your organization. Maybe you are a kind of a gatekeeper in a good way, and that you can say, oh, hey, that's not coming through unless we've worked on these various points to make it more accessible. But often, if you're just a person who is trying to do the best work you can, there is a remarkable amount that you can do just by yourself, by informing yourself about the potential accessibility issues around what you're building and working on ways to improve upon those. I think that we can still infuse things into our own day-to-day work, even if no one is sort of telling us that we need to.
yeah. And I think the alternative is really, and it's kind of there's like a carrot and stick approach, right?
Mm-hmm.
The more punitive approach has been to talk to examples where companies have been sued about, around not being accessible. And that's a risk, right? Because there have been, especially in the United States, some pretty significant court cases and judgments where companies have been forced to pay damages and to very quickly become compliant with WCAG
Yeah.
guidelines.
One of those most recent examples was Beyonce and Beyonce's website. So she was sued for the lack of accessibility of her website. And so it can happen even to the most famous of pop stars.
Yeah, yeah. So and obviously you want to avoid those more punitive outcomes, but it's sometimes that is the most convincing way to get people to understand the urgency sometimes that we should be addressing accessibility with.
Yeah, most countries now do have regulation around web accessibility, and most of those are in one way or another based using the WCAG guidelines. And so even if you find it quite difficult to find the legal rules in the country that you're based in, or what the regulation is around it, broadly, most of them will follow WCAG probably 2.1 AA standard. And there are different A-level standards in WCAG. It's A, AA, or AAA, where AAA is the most, say, the highest level of accessibility, and single A is the lowest, so AA is kind of in the middle. And so that's, if you base what you're building around that, then you're usually in a good area.
Yeah, yeah. And to your point, I was looking around last week, and I think that Level Access had a really great checklist. You were speaking earlier about the checklist, the updated 2.2 AA guidelines. Actually, they have all of them, A, AA, and AAA. And it's a great reference to just be able to really get a sense for just how accessible your experience is, even if you're not getting a professional audit done by a company. I saw Jess Weiss just spoke about Fable. Fable is another organization that offers services for testing with folks who have disabilities. And I remember seeing another question around I think from Carlota. I hope I said that right, Carlotta. Resources for facilitating sessions with people who have accessibility needs, especially when they're using assistive technology. So is that something that you have a lot of experience with, Laura?
I have
Or
some experience with it, and although I'm sure I'm nowhere near the research capabilities of many people on this Zoom, but yeah, I've participated in testing sessions with people using various forms of assistive technology. And there are many organizations out there as well that do offer, they have testers Some companies are founded by disabled people and run by disabled people. And one of them I can think of at the moment is Easy Surf. I think they're based in Canada, and they test both websites and games as well. And yeah, it's great to be able to talk to people directly about the problems that they came across when they were using what you're building.
Yeah, and I think here in the US, Knowbility, so it's KNOW is another organization that does a lot of testing. But one of the things, so I'm at user testing, and we've been like doing a lot of testing our platform to figure out what are some best practices for remote testing with people who are using assistive and adaptive technologies. And I think the moral of the story is almost everybody brings their own unique combination of assistive and adaptive technology. So while you might be focused on doing research with people who are using screen readers, they are often using other assistive and adaptive technologies, which includes other people. So one of the things that I've gotten in the habit of doing is, as a part of every test, essentially interviewing people about what technologies they use. So yes, there's something that I want specifically to be testing in the context of a specific test, but I've learned so much about all of the other strategies that people are using in addition to the screen reader sometimes. And I think that's one area. And I think I just think for best practices for testing, letting people self-report, but as you pointed out, Laura, like this is a consent, like you have to consent to provide that information. And so giving people the freedom, but also the ability to not self-report disability if they don't wish. And also asking for feedback about the test. That has been like a real game changer for me. So, I've been doing research for decades. And one of the things that we don't do enough, I think, is solicit feedback about our test strategies from participants. And especially if you're not experienced in testing with people who are using assistive and adaptive technology, then asking for feedback about how you did will help you to get better the next time.
I love that. And I think that that is a great thing to take into any kind of form of accessibility. It's about self-reporting. It's the most important thing, is to listen to people when they tell you things and not make assumptions about how they use something, not make assumptions based on their disabilities or what they decide to use. And yeah, trust what people tell you.
Yeah, agreed. So shifting gears a little bit, last week there was a fairly controversial post about artificial intelligence and accessibility that people were discussing. But what I wanted to hear is your perspective about the impact that artificial intelligence might have on improving accessibility.
Well, I mean, artificial intelligence has a lot of issues in general when it comes to things like the environment and uh, whether it's being built off of people's unpaid labor. But I'm going to just put those issues to one side for a moment. And I think one of the things that artificial intelligence has actually improved upon significantly is the ability to transcribe people's voices. And that is something that we've been doing for a long time, but it has improved enormously thanks to AI. And what that has enabled is things like being able, if someone is using their voice to interact with something, it is more accurate. And if you're trying to get captions, say from this Zoom call, there will be captions automatically generated, and those will be a lot better than they would have been before. Now, we do, of course, have to think about the privacy considerations if someone is relying upon their voice to communicate with their device and whether that is going somewhere else without their knowledge. But I think that in those simple tasks, AI can really be very valuable. And I think that it can make things accessible. The only thing is you do need to check its homework. You can't just let it automate sort of captions for you you need to check them to check that they're right, particularly when it is a topic that is maybe very technical or has jargon associated with it. That's where a lot of the time AI can fall down. If you're a non-native English speaker, tends to be very biased towards English speakers, very biased towards male voices, often American voices as well, like the North American accent, and it's much better at generating captions for that. But those areas, it is beneficial. Now, in this article last week, Jacob Nielsen proposed that AI could be used to generate an interface that is suitable to any particular user, specifically those with disabilities. So you could just say, hey, this is what I need, this is my disability, and it will generate a UI for you. I'm not sure that's really something that AI can do to begin with. I don't know if any of you have interacted with any of these AI tools, but accuracy is a huge issue with them, particularly if you want reliable information. And a lot of the time, the tools that you might be using, you need specific information. You might be going out there looking for information about a health issue, a way to interact with a public service, something very important that you don't want to get wrong. You don't just want AI guessing at it. And so it is not very realistic in that way. But it also is, again, going back to this idea of having a specific interface just for a person based on a specific disability, rather than making something that is accommodating to a huge variety of needs and allowing people to choose how they want to interact with it. It's about singling people out and often identifying them based upon disability as well. And so it's not a viable solution, certainly not right now, but it's also perhaps relies on a lot of assumptions around how disabled people use the web that aren't really real. I don't know Jacob Nielsen himself has a disability, but it doesn't seem to speak to a lot of people's experiences where he said that accessibility had failed and that it just wasn't possible for the web to be accessible. But I think there are many people using the web regularly today that can say, hey, that's not true. It is actually, we are getting better. We are learning, and we don't want to throw all of that out and replace it with AI.
Well, it's interesting. I think it also assumes that AI can do this tomorrow. And, even though it's improving, I'm sure, for those of us who've seen the difference between ChatGPT 3.5 versus 4.0, huge differences, but I don't think that even, a 4.5, for example, would support complete personalization for an individual. So what do we do until AI could even potentially deliver on that promise? I think we still have a responsibility to ensure that what we create between now and whenever that is optimized for people.
I think a lot of what he was describing, it sounded particularly like he was focused on screen readers. Often people do think of accessibility in screen readers. There are plenty of other forms of accessibility and different types of technology that people use that aren't just screen readers. But I think basically he was describing a really good chatbot. And that's already an interface that kind of exists and has its limitations as well.
Yeah, I think so. And I think one of the things that I'm seeing, so I've been tracking in the United States, the Centers for Disease Control every year release statistics on like the prevalence of different areas of disability. So around mobility and personal maintenance and cognitive disability and vision and hearing. And usually vision is the second least prevalent area of disability, and usually mobility is the number one. But in 2023, for the first time, cognitive disability is the most prevalent area of disability. And the hypothesis there is that the inflammation from COVID is actually negatively impacting the cognitive abilities of younger people and disabling a great quantity of them, and to see if we can pull up some of the links to some of that data. There's the article, it's an infographic that the CDC produces every year called Disability Affects All of Us. So you can look at that. It comes out in May. So I
Yeah, I
wanted to
think
get your sense.
memory
Yeah.
is one of those elements that I think is often, particularly when we're talking about COVID, and it's one of those things that people don't really think about in terms of accessibility. Things like the humble breadcrumb, the way that it can tell you where you came from and where you are right now. Sort of a lot of those kinds of elements make things more accessible for people who do have difficulties with their memory.
Yeah. And we also see that impacting how people are writing tests, right? So shorter instructions, more repetition, and also designing products too. So your example of breadcrumb is, spot on. But I think, when we think about how do we focus, if you were to prioritize other areas of disability that are really important beyond screen readers in the space that most of us are working in, which is digital, what would be that next area?
Oh, that's a difficult one.
Yeah.
Now, I would say that actually one of the things that can affect a huge range of people, and it kind of is close to the cognitive area, or overlaps with it, is the idea of making things easy to understand in terms of text and labels, because that doesn't just benefit people with cognitive issues, it benefits people who may not speak the language that the interface is in. It benefits people who may be unfamiliar with the terms that you're using, if you use very technical terms, long words, things like that. And so I think that actually plain language is one of the easiest ways to accommodate a huge variety of people.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I have found that to be very true. Very, very true.
Yeah, and
So,
it's true for anyone who's new to an interface or new to an industry or a space or a topic as well.
yeah, or language, as you pointed out. Yeah. So I'm going to shift gears and ask a few questions. So I've been seeing some come up, and if you have something come to mind, please feel free to drop it in to chat. So Boris said, oh, hi, Boris. Good to see you. Feels like most digital products are not accessible. So in your experience, so Laura, this is to you, do humans with accessibility needs have low expectations when using digital products? And does it impact their use of products that they actually try? Like, do people avoid using products because they assume that they're not accessible?
In my experience, people are completely different, and it's their approach and their perspectives are so wide ranging, so I couldn't really summarize for a large group of people. But to the degree that I can generalize, I think that for one, there's not really any such thing as 100% accessibility, because there are so many varieties of needs that overlap in unexpected ways, and often those needs can be in conflict with each other, and what one person needs is the opposite and actually can make it more difficult for somebody else. And that's why accommodation is important, but it also is sometimes just how things work. And so we all come across barriers when we're using things like a particularly tricky interface, a bug that is unexpected, something that we're not really sure how to use. But I think that a lot of people, yeah, they know that the tools that work for them, they will return to the products and services that did work for them, and they appreciate that and they are loyal to them. And most people will give anything a go once, but will very quickly reject it if they have a bad experience, or if they can't use it. Because if you can't use it, you can't use it. But also, why return to it if you had a bad experience before? So it's important in accessibility that you're thinking about the fact that if you're often, one of the old things we used to hear was, well, there aren't any disabled people using our product. And often the answer was, well, because they can't. You can't record how many people are because no one is able to actually start using it in the first place. You've stopped them at the first hurdle.
Yeah. And that's a great point. If you make it impossible, erect so many barriers, people aren't going to come. So Shelby asked the question, and this is, I know, a topic that you cover in your book, about when is it most beneficial to implement accessibility features. So across the development life cycle, does it make sense to start at the lo-fi prototype, phase, to wait till you're at the high fidelity phase? I know a lot of us wait until we're in QA, for example. But what are your thoughts about when that should happen?
You can get started at any phase. However, it will usually be the least expensive to start as early as possible. And I'm talking before lo-fi even. When you're considering what you are going to what you're going to build, like what your features are, what your goals are, that's the phase when you should start thinking about accessibility, because that way it will have an impact on everything that you do. And I find that that is one of the best ways to infuse accessibility into everything that you do. It's why my book's called Accessibility for Everyone, because part of the point of it was that it touches every different discipline that is working on a product, has a role within accessibility. Everything we do is affected by accessibility and can affect accessibility. And so it's almost like a mindset, a way of working. In the same way that you might perhaps think about your business goals as you are working through all of the different life cycle of a product, it's thinking about accessibility and what at that particular stage could be affected.
It's interesting. I had this conversation. So I met one of the directors of product management at Shell Games, Alexis Miller, at a conference some time back, and she had developed a gaming accessibility framework that Shell Games starts to use very early in their development process, which is really around setting up heuristics around the goals are going to be this. And so they kind of stage gate their development process by assessing the accessibility for different types of gamers with those goals. And they've got something like 30 or 40 of them. But I thought it was a really fascinating way to not wait until QA to just check ARIA labels, right? ARIA tags.
Yeah, as we know, it is always expensive to change something after it's been completely built. And if you haven't thought about it from earlier on in the process, then you're going to often have to write different code. You're going to have to design a slightly different way of interacting with it. And all of these things are expensive changes to make.
Yes, they are, very much so. And one thing that we haven't touched on yet, but I'm looking at the chat and just seeing people talking about this, which is kind of the Microsoft model of accessibility, where, primarily we've been talking about people who have permanent disability, right? But there are people who experience disability either temporarily or situationally. So can you just talk a little bit about how you think about approaching the design process for those folks who might be experiencing temporary or impermanent disability?
Yeah, so it's similar to what I was saying right back at the beginning, where I was talking about making something easy to see, easy to hear, easy to use, and easy to understand. Because there are all of these different things that can affect how we use all the products that we're using. And so one of those examples is, well, okay, maybe you don't normally have a disability related to motor skills, but you broke your arm. And now you can't use things in the way that you were before. You suddenly have accessibility needs. They're not permanent, but they are no less inhibiting than anybody else, even if they're not permanent. For example, I get very bad RSI in my arm and my hand. And on the days where it's really bad, I can't use a trackpad. I can't use a trackpad at all. I can't use a mouse. And so I have to use a keyboard to interact with things. And then I'm suddenly thrown into a world of keyboard accessibility, which is actually another great way of having a quick test of a web product, is whether you can browse it entirely using a keyboard, because that's a way that a huge number of people do if they have motor difficulties. Often when it comes to things like audio, we're now really familiar with having captions on videos, and mostly that's come about by social media and the idea that people are often browsing social media platforms with the sound off. But yet that is filling an accessibility requirement for people that couldn't have otherwise heard the sound. And so all of these different like equivalents to disabilities can impact people with completely other needs as well.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I recently saw some data saying that it's mostly younger people who are using captions. And, people assume that it's mostly older people, but it's not. So, someone brought up the point that you should bake accessibility into your design systems. And I think that's one of the coping strategies that I've seen a lot of organizations use in order to scale accessibility. So can you talk about, and I know this is something that comes up towards the end of your book as well, talk a little bit about design systems and the positive impact that they can have on providing a framework for accessibility on a digital experience.
But design systems, and in their way, anything where you are creating documentation to use internally. So I've also seen this implemented as tests, not in the user testing sense, but in the development testing sense when you're testing your software. I spoke to someone who worked at Twitter a long, long time ago, and he was saying that one of the ways that he encouraged accessibility was that if someone created something that failed an automated accessibility test on the software side, that it would throw an error and that they wouldn't be able to like make a pull request for that work, or they wouldn't be able to continue with it until they'd fixed that error in the accessibility. And that actually worked very well as an educational tool and a way of helping people understand as a priority. And is very similar with the idea of using a design system or any other kind of internal documentation, is that it isn't just a way of showing people how to do things right, but it's also about educating people in how to understand what the accessibility considerations are for this particular area of what you're building. And so it is a really great opportunity, rather than accessibility being this quite amorphous big thing that's difficult to understand and get a grasp on how it specifically affects what you're building. You're breaking it in design systems, breaking it down into much smaller components and elements where you can say, okay, what are the considerations around this tiny little section? And it makes it much easier to understand. And also, often these are things that we iterate on and we build upon. And so it can also be easier to, oh, here's a component that isn't yet very accessible, and we're just working on iterating this one component. And so we can just work on that and iterate on that and bring that into the product. And we've made it step by step that little bit more accessible.
Yeah, and I love design systems for that reason. So, and education is 100% a very important part, right, of making accessibility a reality at an organization.
And it also benefits consistency and uniformity, which are other things that really benefit accessibility. If you're talking about cognitive difficulties or usability difficulties in general, like having a product that is consistent, that it is uniform, that you use your different areas of it in similar ways, you could learn how to use it and then take those learnings to other areas and use those. And design systems really enable that way of building things.
Yeah, they do. They do. That's a great point. So a final thought before we turn things back over to Danielle to close out today, but I just wanted to ask, is there something that you wanted to share that just is really interesting, or like a bit of advice for those of us who are trying to improve our own approaches to accessibility?
I think my advice would be, don't be intimidated by it. There are many ways in which accessibility can be intimidating to people. Perhaps if you're not disabled yourself, often you feel intimidated by doing the wrong thing or saying the wrong thing or interacting in the wrong way. I think if you are trying with your best intent, you're usually doing okay and making sure that you are asking and speaking to disabled people about their true lived experiences and respecting that. And I think that if you can just learn a little bit at a time for what is relevant to what you are working on, you will build up a breadth of knowledge very quickly. And it's actually really interesting. It provides great constraint to your work, which can also breed great creativity.
Oh, that's a really great point. We had one last question, so I'm going to sneak this one in. I think this is to both of us. Do we think that accessibility research should be a distinct role, or should all researchers learn how to do research alongside people who are living with disabilities?
Well, I would definitely say that everyone should include it in their research. If in your research you are trying to represent a wide audience, then it makes sense. It stands to reason to include people with disabilities in that.
Yeah. So I know of a few. I have one former student who actually is an accessibility UX researcher. And she is the only person I know who actually has that job title. So I'd say, like, just based on budget alone, it makes sense that a lot of organizations right now are relying on maybe a few people whose primary responsibility is UX research, but then they're also expanding their remit to cover more. But, and this is interesting because I'm preparing for another talk with someone who's at Fable, and he was making the point that with artificial intelligence kind of coming to the fore, that we're going to need even more people who have that skill set to accommodate an even broader range of combinations of areas of disability. So
And
I think that it may be now everybody should do it, but that we might have special area focus specialists in the future.
And it's always so valuable to have specialists in this area who can help people who may be more generalist learn how to do best practices as well. Those people who have taken more time to develop in that area greater. The world needs specialists as well as it does generalists, that's for sure.
Yeah, agreed. Well, thank you so much, Laura. This has been a great conversation, and I really appreciate your taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all the great questions, everyone.
Yeah. And I'll turn it back over to Danielle to close us out.
Oh, thank you. That was wonderful. And thanks for all of the lively discussion in the chat and the resources that folks have shared. That was great. We do have a survey that goes, we're the Researchers Guild, so we'd love to hear your feedback on this session, ways to improve it, or things you'd like to see in the future. That link will be in the chat as well. And we'd like to have some networking breakout sessions here. But first, I think we want to do the giveaway. Is that right, Raymond? Yes. Okay. So Leah, it's up to you to go through those questions and determine who should we be giving our copy of Interviewing Users to this session.
So I'm actually going to pick Shelby Graham.
Great.
Yeah, I thought the question about, like, when do you implement accessibility is probably one of the biggest challenges that every organization faces. So great question.
All right. Shelby, we will be in touch to get that copy over to you. Raymond, did you have anything to add there?
I was just going to say the book promotes Leah's next book group, which we hope will be in June, with Steve Portugal, covering his latest release of his latest edition of Interviewing Users.
Great. Awesome. Okay. So with that, I will create some breakout rooms for those of you who'd like to stick around for the networking. We'll put you in small groups and have some follow-up discussion. Thank you everyone for joining today. This was great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, Laura, Leah. Awesome.